very important webinar. Okay, recording in progress. That's great news. Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, Patti Broadfoot. She brings an absolute wealth of expertise to her role as a registered social worker in private practice. As an author, death doula, speaker, and educator, Patti is dedicated to supporting individuals facing grief and loss, life-altering diagnoses, anxiety, and chronic pain. Patti's approach centers on empowering clients to tap into their innate wisdom and resilience, fostering growth and healing amidst challenging circumstances. Beyond her practice, Patti is committed to fostering a more informed and compassionate community. She actively engages in raising awareness and understanding of issues that impact us all. Patti strives to equip individuals with the tools and knowledge needed to navigate tender conversations with grace and compassion. And that is who Patti is, and a whole lot more. And now I'm going to turn it over to Patti. And if I've missed anything, Patti, please feel free to round out my introduction.
Thank you, Catherine. No, I think you've covered a lot of it. I'm just gonna share my screen, if that's okay. And let me know if we're good.
Yeah, looks good, Patti.
Good. Okay. So first, I want to thank McCormick Dementia Foundation for inviting me to join everyone today, for creating a space for these important conversations. You know, many of the conversations that we will talk about today become really important when someone is living with dementia or other serious illnesses. And so when we're planning ahead and trying to understand someone's wishes, it can make a meaningful difference for families and care partners when we've had those conversations. Thank you to everyone out there for joining us today. I think, you know, these conversations can feel incredibly difficult to begin. And so my hope today is that in some way I can share an approach to these conversations with some clarity, some confidence, some compassion when supporting individuals and their care partners. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that this topic is, you know, it can bring up some very personal experiences. And so some of you may be currently supporting someone you love. Others may be reflecting on experiences from the past of supporting someone. So please make sure that you take care of yourself during these conversations today. If you need to pause, take a pause. If you need to take a breath or step away for a moment, that's completely okay. The care of you is really important. I also want to say I have saved some time at the end for some questions, so you can type your questions into the chat, and Catherine and Sonia will read them out later. I don't think we can talk one-on-one with them, or can we? We can. Okay, so you have to type in the chat. So I'll make sure I leave time. If there's something really burning question, you know, Catherine and Sonia, if you see something coming up, and I'm okay if you interrupt me as well, if you think it's pertinent to what we're talking about, and just let me know, and we can pause for a moment. So who am I? Catherine gave you a great little synopsis about who I am. And so I just wanted to share a little bit about who I am and kind of the work that I do. So I am a registered social worker and death doula. My work focuses on supporting individuals and families who are navigating serious illness, end of life, grief, and burnout. I often work with people in moments where things really feel uncertain, overwhelming, or really emotionally heavy. And so this is where, you know, conversations can feel really hard to start. So much of my role is about helping people slow things down, find some clarity, feel supported in those moments. You know, most of us don't grow up talking about death, planning, or grief really in a direct way. And yet at some point, you know, many of us find ourselves in the middle of it, often without feeling fully prepared. So today isn't about doing things perfectly. It's about opening the door to those conversations that can make things just a little clearer, and somewhat a little bit less overwhelming. So, what is a death doula? Many people for a long time had no idea what a death doula is. However, I've noticed there's more and more understanding as more and more people enter this kind of field of work. So when people hear the term death doula, they really aren't quite sure what that means. Um, I often describe my role as being a ribbon that's kind of woven throughout someone's experience. I'm not there to replace medical team or any one of the team. I'm there to actually walk right alongside with everyone. Um, I support conversations, help people reflect on what matters, to provide emotional and practical support, and just to be a steady presence before, during, and after death. Often I reflect on it this way. Often people will come see me, even sometimes pre-diagnosis, because they know there's something serious happening. And so I start with them there. We talk about what life is like for them, what is meaningful. When then somebody's diagnosed, I'm going to use ALS because that gives a nice, clear pass along. And so, when somebody's diagnosed with ALS, their family doctor's involved. The family doctor then passes them off to the neurological team, who the ALS doctor takes care of them up to a certain point, and then they're passed off to a palliative team. So my role through all of that would be woven in that consistency. We started together. I know wishes and understand who the person is and what they're hoping for throughout this journey. And so often that continuity gets missed. And so that's where a death doula, I'm also a social worker, so both roles kind of are nicely woven into that to help provide continuity of care for that client and family. How a death doula can help in this situation of serious illness, dying, death, and bereavement. Support looks different for everyone, but it often includes, supporting advanced care planning conversations, from just the conversation of wishes to actually helping people prepare, all the paperwork, POA stuff, helping arrange wills, that kind of stuff. Helping people explore their wishes and values. People will say, well, I want this to go to this person, like all of the practical matter, but they often don't stop and pause on kind of what their wishes and values are as they navigate through this part of life. Navigating resources and supports. We know that the system is often really stretched, and caregivers, which we'll talk about later, get very stretched. And so navigating and helping people find resources to support everyone through the process. Advocacy, helping ensure voices are heard. That is a big part. We often don't know where we can step up and say, or ask, or even know that we can ask. And so in our role, we can, help ensure that voices are being heard. Legacy work and reflection. I often have worked with people and a legacy project on, how do they want to be remembered, or putting together scrapbooks, or of course, with all the digital things, doing kind of a digital. One fun one I did was kind of almost like a reporter asking the person, who are you, what stories, all of that kind of stuff, which they had put together in a little video montage for their family to have afterwards. Um, Another role of death doulas is being present during the dying process. There's a lot of things that happen that can be scary, people don't understand. And so just having that person with the knowledge, understanding, and the ability to help hold space and difficult emotions that often come up at those times. And then, of course, offering grief support afterwards. So it's really about meeting people where they are, what their needs are, and helping them really feel less alone in all of it. So why? Why do these conversations matter? What I see over and over again is that people aren't avoiding these conversations because they don't care. They avoid them because they care too much. They don't want to upset someone. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They're hoping that there's more time. But what ends up happening is that decisions still need to be made. You know, without those guidelines, those conversations could have given, an understanding of what somebody really wanted. These conversations matter because serious illness often brings up serious, difficult decisions. Families may be asked to speak on someone's behalf, and often, wishes are not clearly known. When conversations do happen, they can provide clarity. They can, reduce the uncertainty of, would this be the right thing? Is this what, I don't know. Do you think they want this? Or do you think they would want that? It helps the people making those decisions feel more confident. And more importantly, it helps to honor what matters most to that person. They create space for connection when you actually sit down and have those conversations, which is something people often remember for a long time after. I know with clients that I've had, I had somebody a few weeks ago, we sat down and had this difficult conversation. They have had a terminal illness. It is progressing. And so we looked at what does this look like for you? What wishes and what are the values and how does this come through? And one, they were so relieved. They've been wanting to talk about that with somebody and nobody has actually brought it up. And so it's tough to get started, but afterwards, I think everybody feels just that much more confident, and lowers the anxiety around it all. What I don't think we often are aware of is that, for many care partners, grief does not begin only after death. Grief can begin so much earlier. As things change, as things happen, as abilities, if we look at dementia, how much there is loss all along the way from diagnosis. You're constantly, that person and the people around them are constantly losing things. As the person, your loved one becomes different to who they once were. This is called anticipatory grief, the anticipation of what's to come and the grief that's associated with all of those loss. Loss is any reaction, any normal reaction to loss. It's not to death, it's to loss. And we have so many more non-death losses in our life than we actually have death losses. And I think we forget to recognize that. So, it's very real and very, very common experience for caregivers to experience anticipatory grief, especially in illnesses like dementia. So, advanced care planning. When people hear the term advanced care planning, they often think about forms, right? Like power of attorney, medical directives, um, wills, those kind of things. And while those documents are very important, advanced care planning is also really about the conversation. It's about understanding what matters the most to someone, their values, their wishes, and their priorities for care. Because when families understand those things, they're better able to make decisions in honor of that person. So starting that conversation, the tough one, right? Many people want to have these I want to talk to them. I don't know how to start. I don't know what to say. And so, often it's not about having the perfect words. It's actually just about opening the door to that conversation. Sometimes starting with curiosity can help, things like what would matter most to you if your health changed? You know, or who would you want to speak for you if you couldn't? These questions help people reflect on their values and wishes. You know, I often think too, how many times you're watching a television program and on the program comes a situation. And that's a great doorway in. Oh, I don't know whether I like what's happening there. If that was me, I would like this. What would you like? It's amazing how those conversations can start in spaces you not normally think about. Um, and so it's taking that deep breath and starting really is the big thing. Um, But though, and yet, even knowing how important they are, these conversations are often avoided. And I want to add, these conversations are often avoided even within the medical world. I've have had many people say, the doctor didn't say anything about any of this, the nurses, the medical team, nobody's ever really come out and said anything about, what's really happening. So even, it's hard for everybody to start those conversations. You know, they can feel very, very overwhelming. You know, Talking about serious illness, decline, or death can feel very uncomfortable, and we don't want to upset that person that's sitting in front of us. Um, Oftentimes, we are so worried that we're going to upset them. We live in a death denying world where death conversations people really struggle with. You start it and they're like talking about the weather or what happened with the Blue Jays, or you can see things, how people can try and change the topic really quickly. Um, the other thing that complicates things is family dynamics. Family dynamics can make these discussions really complex. People may have different perspectives or beliefs about care and decision making within the same family. I've seen it. I've seen, where a decision was having to be made about a client who was um, going to have a procedure, not able to give consent. The family really struggled to know what to do. They assumed signing a DNR would be the best thing. The person recovered, and this is the same family, and the person was furious that somebody signed a DNR. They wanted absolutely everything. However, everybody before was so afraid to have a conversation. They thought they had more time. Had they had that difficult conversation, then they would have made that decision for that family. And so the family, we all sat down and had a good discussion about what does, serious illness, end of life decisions kind of look like for each one of them, so that they would have a better understanding, should the need for it arise. So, these barriers are very, very common, and many, many, many people experience them. Avoidance of conversation is very, very human. Avoid can make things really a lot harder later in life. Healthcare conversations. So up until now, we've been kind of talking about the why this matters, why it's hard. But at some point, this stops kind of being theoretical, and people find themselves in a position where someone turns to them and says, "What do you think we should do?" And that's a very different experience. You know, these conversations are not about having all the answers. They're about asking the questions and making informed decisions together. At some point, families will find themselves having to make very important decisions and conversations with healthcare providers. And often, those decisions don't involve the person who is experiencing that serious illness. And so, these conversations may include, understanding the person's condition, discussing treatment options, talking about goals of care and what does that look like. Families may also want to ask questions or inform that healthcare team about quality of life, and what different care options might look like. One of the most important roles care partners often play is helping communicate the person's values and wishes and who they are as a person and what matters most to them. I reflect on, there's a famous doctor in the US called Atul Gawande, who talks about these difficult conversations and knowing. He's a surgeon. And he often talks about when he goes to do a surgery of knowing kind of the person themselves, their wishes, and what matters most to them. And he reflects on one of a case of someone who had a tumor that was wrapped around the spinal cord. And so, he said, okay, how do I know how far to go? If this involves you losing the ability for you to walk, where does this fall? What is important to you? And he reflected, he's had two of those different scenarios. And the one person said, I love to play tennis. I'm a runner. If, that's my stopping point. I want to be able to have my legs in use. So if it means you have to stop the surgery early, I'm okay with that. Where another person said, you know what, I'm active, but I'm okay as long as I can sit in my on my chair, my armchair on Sunday and watch football, I'm good. So go as far as you can. So there's, the same surgery, but two different scenarios based on what matters most to that person. And so, I think it's important that if the care team isn't bringing this up, that you also bring this up as to who this person is and, what matters most to them. Um, So, moving into some of the practical matter stuff that I think people often don't understand, when someone's no longer able to make their own healthcare decisions, another person will be asked to speak on their behalf. We hope in the world that people have made, their power of attorney. There is two. There's a power of attorney for personal care. That's the one I'm going to talk about most today. But there's also a power of attorney for finances. Those are two totally separate um, forms that somebody would fill out and sign. But unfortunately, not this doesn't happen for everybody. It happens a lot in not time, more more than we actually think. And so when that happens, and somebody does not have a POA assigned to them, then there is this hierarchy of substitute decision makers that you see on the screen. So then, it will move into if a person has a court-appointed guardian, sometimes that's part of it. There's that POA for care in that yellow section, a representative that's appointed by consent and capacity board. Then when we don't have those formal pieces of information or signed paperwork, then the hierarchy will go to a spouse or a partner. And this is something to consider. I've had situations where there was no POA paperwork. And so it then went to spouse or partner, and the person was separated and had been for 10 years. Well, that they were still married. So that was actually causing some issues because the partner stepped in. And so, this is where those difficult conversations are important, right? Where can we get this talked about so that we make sure we have the appropriate people talking for us? Even when it's POA, we often think, okay, it needs to be my partner. So, if you're married, your partner, I have a girlfriend, she said to me, I don't know what to do. She said, because I know it should be my husband that is my POA, but he will be a total basket case. There is no way he's going to be in shape to make decisions. And so we had to talk about that. I said, why do it doesn't have to be your partner. It does not have to be this child. It could be this child. It could be two people together. It could be a friend of yours who that will honor your wishes. So it does not always have to be that person who you think it should be. However, in the case of the substitute decision maker, they go through this. So they'll go through spouse or partner, then they'll go through the children. Then they'll go, if it's a child, they'll go through the parents with how the rights go. Then it goes down to siblings. Then they go try and find in the situations like that where we're trying to find any kind of living relative that's around. And then failing that, there is a system called the public guardian and trustee that will step in and make decisions. So I think it's important to understand these kind of things and how the roles are designed based on based on decision making. Um, so that you can also reflect on. I think we forget that too as caregivers, you know, we need to make sure our paperwork's involved too, because if something happens to us, then who is going to care for those around me? Future conversations. So I think, we forget that advanced care planning is not just a one-time conversation. It's something that unfolds often over time. You know, illness and health journeys often have a natural kind of, I call them pivot points, moments when it makes sense to revisit the conversations, whether it's a new diagnosis, a hospitalization, a notable change in health function, a shift in treatment options. Any of those can open that door to revisit kind of what matters most. And, these conversations ensure that that care continues to reflect on the person's values, wishes, and circumstances. Many times I've had conversations with people, um, and, right off the bat, their first response is, I'm going to go back to ALS because it often has some really clear pivot points. So, I've had clients who say, as soon as I lose the function of my legs and I can't walk, again, there's that runner, I'm athletic. I don't think I could live life without being able to get up and move. And so, we talk about that, we make note of that. And I also mentioned that, maybe when that time approaches closer, we will revisit it just to make sure that that's where they're, that they're feeling. Oftentimes we get to that point and they will say, yeah, I'm actually okay. I'm still able to enjoy my family. I'm still able to go on outings. I'm okay, and then we talk about the next kind of goal of care and what that looks for like for them. Okay, if I, become unable to speak, or I have to be have a trach put in, like let's have another conversation there. And so there's lots of those moments of like a natural pivot point. What pivot point in where can we have that conversation again? Going back to, okay, what does this look like for you? What is quality of life for you? This person who was a runner who said, no, 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 I can't even do that. Now is at a point they're not functional to get up and go walk and go run, but they are comfortable with being able to be engaged in family functions, be able to go to the dinner table and enjoy their family. And so there's that shift and change, right? It's always changeable. When wishes are not known, which happens so much, sometimes these conversations never happen. And I really want to say this clearly. That does not mean anyone did something wrong. It just means that life happened. It means that timing didn't line up, or it felt too hard, or there was always that sense of we'll get to it, we will get to it, we will get to it. And then suddenly you're being asked to decide anyways. Illnesses can progress quickly, or conditions like dementia can affect someone's ability to communicate their wishes. In those moments, families are often asked to make a very, very important decision um, without knowing exactly what their loved one would want. And, that carries a lot of emotional weight. Most families do the best they can, guided by love and what they believe their person valued. And I think that's really important. We really will beat ourselves up in, I don't know what to do. What do you think? Should we do this? Da, 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 da. But I really think it's important to give yourself a little bit of grace, because, I know that you will make your best decisions based by, what you believe that person valued. So, making those decisions, right? One of the most difficult moments is when you're asked to make a decision and that person's wishes are not clearly known. I reflect back to that family who's, having to make a decision of a DNR for their loved one, and not knowing if that's something they would want or not something they do want, they don't want. We're going to make a decision based on what we feel that they would want. And so in those situations, I really encourage people to reflect on who that person was. What are their values? What are their beliefs? What mattered most to them? If you think about yourself, who are you? What do you value most? Is it family? Is it nature? Is it, what is that? Do I value, what beliefs come into this? What matters most to me? Some people do honestly like that quantity of life. I want to do absolutely everything I can in order to live as long as possible. Where other people would say, no, that's not me. I want quality. I want the time I have to involve all of the things that I love. And so, sometimes I describe this as trying to step into someone's skin. You know, if you're trying to make that decision, if you put yourself in their skin, what would they want if they could speak today? What does that look like? What do you think they would say? Family often don't realize that they actually know more than what they think they do. The emotional side of conversations. This is not just all the practical stuff. They are deeply, deeply emotional. And so, families often experience fear, uncertainty, sadness. How did we get to here and having to make these decisions? And sometimes, or a lot of times, I hear a lot about guilt. When making decisions for someone they love, there's so many emotions mixed into all of this. And at the same time, these conversations all come from a place of love and care. We love the person, we care for them, and we want the best through this. It's important to remember that there is no right way and there is no wrong way when you're navigating these serious illness or end of life decisions. Something else I think that is not addressed enough, and a lot of people really suffer in silence, is the impact on caregivers. Supporting someone through serious illness can be incredibly, incredibly meaningful, but it also can be physically and emotionally demanding. Care partners witness the decline of their loved one. They navigate family dynamics. They carry anticipatory grief long before the death, occurs. They're often juggling care teams. We know that there is such a shortage on enough help. And so, who is usually taking most of the physical care? That care partner that's in that home. And so, a lot of people hesitate, one, to ask for more help because they don't realize, they can ask for it. We just assume that they would just give us what we need. But they also, many people hesitate to ask for the emotional support because they feel they need to stay strong for everyone else. And oh, it must be just me. I'm just weak in this. No, not at all. Like, over time, this leads to emotional exhaustion, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, into caregiver burnout. And so it's really important that you recognize the impact that caring for someone carries with you. So, burnout, compassion fatigue, and empathy fatigue is a concept that comes up a lot. It's actually last year, from December 2024 until March of 2025, my area of clients that I see, grief, bereavement, some few little other things, but burnout and compassion. And burnout and compassion fatigue, I saw more people through those 4 months with burnout and compassion fatigue than I did with my end of life clients or grief and bereavement. And so I think that speaks to a bigger topic of people not realizing how heavy caregiving can be. And so, I gently want to shift how we think about it. You know, often it's not that someone has too much compassion, it's that they've been holding a lot for a very long time without enough support for themselves. And so, when you're constantly tuned into someone else's needs, their distress, their changes, their needs, your system doesn't always get a chance to come back down. And so, what we often call today compassion fatigue, it's more like emotional overload or empathetic distress. And I think it's really important. It's not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's often a sign that you've been caring deeply without enough space for you to be supported yourself. Care partners are often the steady ones, the organizer, the one that holds everything together. But that doesn't mean it's not taking a toll on themselves. This is where support becomes essential, not because you're not coping, but because you shouldn't have to carry it alone. Care partners also need care partners. So I want to move into a little bit of loss. I talked about it a little bit earlier. Loss is not only about death. Loss can be experienced by both care partners and the person living with the illness. I often think we forget about that person that's living with the illness. You know, Someone living with dementia also experiences anticipatory grief, ambiguous loss, and secondary losses all at once. So, they're moving through loss just as much as the people that are around them. The loss might include for them, the loss of independence, the loss of role they're no longer the person who's going out and cutting the grass or repairing how things around the house, or in the case of the person who likes to do the laundry and the washing and grocery shopping. Those roles and identities um change when cognitive decline happens. The loss of memory or abilities. There is a great amount of time that people realize that they are losing memory and their abilities. And there's grief. There's grief in that, that anticipation of what's coming, because we all know what comes with decline with dementia. The loss of routines and familiar activities. We as humans really, really do well when we have routine and familiar things. And so, when there is serious illness or dementia involved, those kind of things, routines do change. And so those familiar activities do change. And that's a loss. We're not able to go and do. The loss of future and the future plans and expectations. We all write a story of what we think life will be like. We all hope that it's like, if you know the movie The Notebook, we all hope that we live, I always say, happy, healthy, happy, healthy, happy, healthy, dead. But unfortunately, that's not what life is like. We have this story that we write about life, that we're going to live to we're, 95 and be independent and explore the world, but often that's not what happens. And so when that story changes, there's grief in that. There's grief in that our story didn't work out as planned. And so, again, that loss and grief is often experienced long before death ever occurs. So caring for yourself, supporting someone through illness, as I've kind of talked about, is that it is a huge emotional weight. Care partners experience emotional fatigue, uncertainty, trying to make difficult decisions. Should I do this? Should I do this? Should I do this? On top of feeling very overwhelmed with caring. There's a lot that people have to carry. Those moments of guilt or doubt. We often talk about decision fatigue. There's so many decisions that have to be made. And, when you're feeling overwhelmed and exhausted, that makes, you know, decisions even more difficult. And then those moments of guilt sneaking in, how many people struggle with the decision of moving their loved one into long-term care? And, it's they never wanted to go, they never wanted to be there, and we don't, as much as we don't want to make that decision, sometimes that is the safest and the best decision. And so, guilt has a way of stepping in and reminding us that this is not something we wanted to do. There's often a time that, feeling very alone in the responsibility of caring, we are not meant to carry things alone. And so I think it's important to make sure as well that you find that support around you, find the right information, have conversations with people that will help make this journey a little less isolating. So, the types of grief that people will experience. Many care partners are actually experiencing multiple types of grief all at the same time. We talked about anticipatory grief. We haven't talked about ambiguous loss. There's two different types of ambiguous loss. That is loss that feels unclear or unresolved. So the first one is the person is physically absent. So this would be like somebody who's missing in a disaster or war. So they are physically absent, but psychologically they're still present. They could be alive. They might find them. May be okay. And then this is more a lot closer to with dementia. They're physically present, but they're psychologically absent. Brain injury, neurological, someone's in a coma. And so that's called ambiguous loss. Cumulative grief, experiencing multiple losses over time. You know, this is, loss built on top of loss, built on top of loss. We also don't, think about secondary losses, like I mentioned before, the change in identity, the roles, somebody's role has changed. They're not able to work anymore, or they're not able to do those things within their family that they normally do, or even daily life. Those are secondary losses. So those all accumulate on top of each other. Um, the next one is disenfranchised grief. Grief that is not always supported or recognized by others. I often talk about to care staff. So, doctors, nurses, PSWs, those types of people. Often they experience this, because they spend many, especially in long-term care, they spend many hours caring for somebody. And they grieve too. That in most facilities, things are now a relationship-based care. And so it's about building a relationship with the person. And so, when that person declines, they feel it too. When that person dies, they feel it too. They lose the person and the family. Often families will come in and they have conversations and you get to know the family. And then when that person dies, the family, they lose the patient, but they also lose the family and those connections too. Um, Secondary losses, which I mentioned up with cumulative grief, all of those additional losses that follow a primary loss. Yeah, and finances, one thing too that people are surprised by. If somebody is having, early onset dementia and has to stop working, there can be a loss of finances that happen in all of that as well. So, so someone feels like grief is, you know, their grief is complex or even hard to name, that's actually very normal because if you look at it, this isn't even the complete list of all the different types of grief that people may experience. So grief is very complex. I also want to consider, it's not uncommon for people to feel relief when the death finally occurs. how many people feel so guilty? Relief, I think we need to look at it in two different ways. One, relief that the suffering has ended. Sad because we're going to miss that person. Their life has ended. You know, the relief does not mean that you love the person any less. You're just relieved that the suffering that was being experienced has been taken, right? It's no longer involved with all of this anymore. We watch people suffer for so long, um, and don't wish for that to go on. And so, guilt is one of those most common emotions people talk about after death. Families also grieve, I think, very differently. Some people want to talk. Let's talk about them. What do you think about this? I'm missing them, like all of those things. Um, But some people stay quiet. Some people move forward quickly while others take more time. And I often see a lot of conflict within families regarding this topic, because they don't understand, this person grieves like this part, this person grieves like this person grieves like this. And so, one of the most important things about grief is that it needs to be witnessed. So, finding a space where you can talk with others. There's lots of grief groups in the community. There's lots of programs that support people who are going through um, a loved one with dementia. I'm quite confident McCormick has that. And so, it's really important to really be connected with people that understand what's happening. When grief can be seen and acknowledged, it becomes more bearable. And once again, it's also being carried by someone with you, and you're not carrying it alone. It's also important for care partners to remember that they are allowed to set boundaries. It's okay to say to somebody, I just need some time to myself. Not today. Or if you finally, go out into something and they want to talk about what's going on at home or about your loss, it's okay to say to them about something else. It's totally okay. You're allowed to set boundaries and you're allowed to ask for support. A final little reflection. These conversations are not about having the perfect answers. We often feel that these conversations need to be done perfectly, or that we need to have everything figured out before we begin. But in reality, what that's not what matters the most. What matters the most is the beginning. It's the sitting, it's the listening, it's the sharing, it's the understanding what matters most to someone, even in small ways. And I also want to say this, sometimes those conversations didn't happen. And if that's part of your experience, that doesn't mean that something was done wrong. It just means that life was happening. It means that life was hard. And it means the moment didn't come together the way we had hoped. And even in those situations, people are still doing their best. You're doing your best to make thoughtful, caring decisions. But when conversations do happen, even the small ones, they can make a profound differences for families later down the road when, you're crossed with that decision on what should I do? How should I do this? What would they want? Those conversations, they help to create clarity. They reduce that uncertainty. They reduce anxiety. And they help people feel more confident that they are honoring the person who they love. So this isn't about getting it perfect. It's about creating the space. It's for understanding, for connecting, and for what matters most. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that we just simply choose to begin. And so I want to thank you for taking time to be here. I have more information. I wasn't sure how much time we would need for conversation and questions. Thank you for being present for, with this conversation. These topics are not easy, but they matter so much. And so, your willingness to engage in them and make a difference is really important. And so if there's any questions or reflections, I'd be happy to open the space for that. I'm going to actually unshare my screen so that I can see faces.
Thanks so much, Patty. Folks who are attending the webinar, the Q&A box, if you look along the bottom of your screen where all the icons are, you'll see participants and chat and raise hands and that sort of thing. Then you'll see a button that says more. That's where you'll find the Q&A. Zoom likes to change things from time to time.
Right. And I
So,
noticed that camera you're talking about, my camera keeps changing.
yeah.
Realized it would do that. Follow me around the room.
Yeah, there you go, Patty. So we invite you folks, type in your questions to the Q&A box. Oh, one of our participants has asked, where can we get the POA papers?
I know I have them on my website. Um, let me think for a minute. Like oftentimes when you're working with lawyers, I know you can Google it and come up with the Ontario website. I wonder if I can ask my
I
quickly.
can Google that while you're talking.
Sure, right? Yeah, Ontario. I know it's different in Quebec, is different. I'm sure it's through the government, the Ontario government website. And so, yeah, if you want to Google, I know the actual paperwork's on. It's just a couple of pages. And so, yeah, you don't have to go to a lawyer to have those things done. You can take care of those yourself. There's so much we can do ourselves for sure.
And even as Catherine's looking for it, she's probably going to put it in the chat box as well. But if anyone can't figure out how to get that and you need us to email you, we'd be more than happy to do that. We can send you that direct link. So feel free to just let us know.
Sure.
Perfect. Yep. It's just ontario.ca. Just Google
Yeah.
POA documents for Ontario, but I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay. Great question. Oh, a couple. Oh, found it. Good job.
Good.
Any other any other questions or thoughts? Or shall we let Patty take it away again? Oh, okay. Here's a question. Go ahead, Sonia. You can read that next question for us.
Um, so this person's just wondering if the power of attorney for financial follows the same hierarchy as the power of attorney for the healthcare and medical.
So if they have a POA, it's separate. But if they don't, is that what they're asking? If they don't have a POA, which
I
is a
think
great
this assumption is yes, if they don't have a
don't have.
POA for
Um,
financial, is it the same hierarchy? Yeah.
it it is not always, and it's getting complex. Um, I don't want to assume. So take this because it's always changing. And I had somebody recently, it was different. They're two separate roles, which we know, one financial, one healthcare. Um, Banks get really sticky, and I'm really hesitant to say because recently the bank wouldn't allow this person to that person. They actually wanted somebody else involved. So oftentimes you'll see it get sticky when it comes to banking and
Yeah.
who can sign paperwork and that kind of stuff. So um,
I'll
No,
refer folks to,
no.
yeah, I'm going to suggest that folks look on our YouTube channel for the most recent
Ah,
webinar dedicated to capacity, substitute decision making,
perfect.
power of attorney, that sort of thing. Here's a great question. What if your loved one's dementia is too far advanced to have this kind of discussion?
Right, which happens so much. Don't we know that? You know, because we often talk about, you know, we know that they don't want to be here, or they don't want to be there. Um, and that's where I think putting yourself in their skin, you know, having a reflection um, of who they are in life. You know, if someone's dementia has progressed to the point where they're no longer have those conversations, then you know, we kind of shift from asking what they want now to asking, you know, what do we know about them? You know, who were they? What mattered to them? You know, how did they live? What kind of values? You know, what would they likely say if they were actually able to speak in this moment? You know, stepping into their skin, not perfectly, but thoughtfully. You know, if those conversations didn't happen, yeah, it's really difficult. It's really difficult to think about. Um, and no, it's not about getting it exactly right. It's about making that thoughtful, caring decision with the information that you have. You know, oftentimes, and sitting and talking with somebody about that too can often bring up, um, oh yeah, you know what? And they wouldn't want this, or they did talk about that, or you know, they just, you know, when they retired, they just wanted to go and sit by the water and fish. They just want to enjoy life. They didn't want to, you know, and so, you know, from that conversation, okay, we know they enjoyed that, you know, the quality of life and what that looked like for them. But it's tough, right? That's where we get into that guilt of, did I make the right decision? How do I make this decision? You know? Um, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
I appreciate how often you've said it doesn't have to be perfect because these are difficult situations to navigate. And I read something today. The comment was feeling sad after making the right decision doesn't
Yeah.
mean that it wasn't the right decision because
Yeah.
these are complex situations and they're just
Right?
layered with feelings and
Yeah,
all of the messiness of the human experience.
true. And I think reflecting on like how many times we've heard a situation, you know, they were someone who always said, you know, I never want to be kept alive on machines, or, you know, quality of life means more to me than the length of my life. Or, you know, maybe they were very independent and valued, you know, making their own decisions. Like that's just something too, right? So then when that decision comes up, you know, what do I think is best? Okay, they valued, you know, being strong and making decisions and fighting the fight. I have a client now who is, you know, I want to do everything because I want to be here. So I know that that is very different than somebody who says to me, I don't want all of the things. I just want to enjoy the time I have left. So those are completely different, you know, ways of being for sure.
The ambiguity.
Ambiguity. It's such a it's like bottom line is it's hard. It is so hard, right? And the recognition that we're grieving as we making these decisions. Every time I have to make this decision about something, it's not because they're getting better. It's about, you know, there's been something change and now I have to make a decision on how do I navigate this change. There's grief in that. There's heaviness in that, right? And the importance of putting that oxygen mask on ourselves is so important, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And given the reality of the situation, like starting that being that acceptance being the starting point. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really true, isn't it?
Just a
I have
nice
a
comment
question.
here.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
Oh, I was just going to read the comment. Go ahead, Sonia.
I was actually going to ask a question, Patty, just along the lines of having the difficult conversation with folks who might not want to have this conversation at all, but you know that some decisions have to be made. And so how you might gently um, approach this with someone who is um, certainly not wanting to have this conversation at all, but you as the caregiver knows eventually you're going to be making those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, I think one is just to call it out too, right? Normalize that discomfort first. These conversations can feel awkward and that's okay. Saying to the person, this is I've been thinking about something lately, right? That kind of casual way in. And I'd like to understand what matters most to you. Or, I've been thinking about this for myself, and this is what I've been thinking about me. If something was to happen to me, if I developed a serious illness, this is what I would like to see. And I think it's important for you to understand that, which often is, the focus is on the person, not necessarily the spotlight on who you're trying to get answers from. And then, that natural kind of into, so, I'd really like to understand what matters most to you too. Can I ask you something that's, important, doesn't have to be a big conversation. I just want to start it. I was reading or hearing about something recently, and it made me realize like I don't actually know. I don't think people here in in my family or friends know what I want. And I realize I don't know actually what you would want. And so, if you ever really got sick, have you ever thought about what would feel most important to you? Right? And I think also the recognition that it doesn't have to be everything all at once. These conversations can happen a little piece and a little piece and a little piece and a little piece over time, which is probably even better, right? Focusing on values, right? Not necessarily decisions right away. Sometimes it's easier to start with what makes life meaningful for you? What would you want to avoid? What matters most if your health was to change? And then make sure, give them permission to stop. It's okay if, this gets in and the conversation doesn't go very far. Even starting it is meaningful to me and it helps me. And then, you don't need the perfect words. You just need a starting point. You're going to stumble through it. I stumble through it. I'm a professional, and sometimes sitting with people, I'm good at starting, but then the feeling out things can get a little bit awkward. That's okay. We just keep going through the weeds. Often people worry they're going to upset their loved ones, which I think is kind of where you're at with that question, Sonia. But, many people really actually feel relieved that someone is willing to ask. The most meaningful conversation I had a couple of months ago with somebody who has had a possibility of a terminal diagnosis. And so, we sat and talked about what do you want to do? They wanted to travel. They want to go to China, and see this and see that, and then they want to travel here. And so, okay, how can we make that happen? I know that those things are important to them. It was starting that conversation, and then what does this look like? We talked about dying. What does that look like for you? Um, they don't want to die at home. They don't want their loved ones caring for them. Cool. We know that now. Awesome. Hospice, they would love that. If not, hospital, I understand. We had so many rich conversations about it all. And at the end of it, they said, I was so nervous to come here and talk about this because I knew this is what we probably were going to do today. But I can't believe how much better and relieved I feel because somebody understands what I want. I know that somebody is going to advocate for me to get those things that I want or need. And so, there's that. Even the person was hesitant about wanting to start that. But then, once you get into it, the relief that you feel. So, I guess bottom line, start gently, keep it simple, and focus on understanding what matters to them, not getting all the answers at once.
I appreciate that so much. It's like just muddle through. right? But do the best you can. There's a great reflection, sort of comment here from one of our attendees. Given the diverse opinions of near kin, recording those difficult conversations to protect oneself as the caregiver or the leader of the conversation from criticism when one conveys what those answers were from the
Yeah.
person with the illness.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
interesting.
in past I changed up my presentation a little bit. I do that from time to time, and maybe I need to put it back in. There's kind of 5 steps to conversations. One is having the conversation. Another part of it is recording that, like writing it down. Um, I've created with clients like a little booklet of this is what I would like. And it's not all the medical stuff. It's their values and wishes and what does this look like. Same thing. Happy to email it out to people if they want a copy of it. Um, and then letting everybody know, right? So we've had this conversation and we just keep it to ourselves. No, no, no. Tell your doctor. Doctor thought the medical profession has shifted so amazingly now. They do value those things. How many especially palliative end of life doctors that value when a family comes and says this is what they would like, right? This is what end of life looks like for them. This is what disease how they want to move through this illness, so that everybody can honor it. Again, when they all have that information, we can. And then I think that question also represents the diversity within families and the family dynamics that comes up, and that is very true. I've seen it where everybody has a different opinion. I think they should do treatment. We're going to talk mom into having all the treatment, but that's not, there's that, in their skin. Is this what mom would want? If you were mom and you were talking through mom, is that what mom would say to you? She wants all the treatment. And then, you have the other one who's like, let's stop all treatment. Like the, and you'll have them all in the same family, often, so often. And so I can see where that, I got to record conversations because nobody's going to believe that this is what they said and da 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 da. So yeah, have the conversations, write it down and share it with everybody so that everybody knows what's happening, right? Yeah.
Yeah, great advice, actually. So often it's hard for families to get clear on what the actual essence of the issue is. I could
Yeah.
use the word problem, but I try not to. It's not like, but also getting clear on the problems.
Yeah,
And
it's
then
true.
how they're communicating around the problem becomes more of an issue than the actual issue,
And
right?
I also think the driver underneath. I spent 10 years at hospice. And, oftentimes I worked more with the families than I did with the clients that were in the bed because the families were struggling so heavily with grief. Here is their loved one. Hospice is a hard place. When you walk through those doors, you know that you're not walking back out them. Typically, that does happen from time to time. But typically, and so the families deal with that too. When we walk through those doors, we know that our loved one's not walking out. And so, all of the emotions that come up with it, anger and like all of that and sadness, and emotions are so complex. And so, yeah, right. We have a lot of very strong opinions that can happen in those moments of how. And oftentimes it's not necessarily the treatment process, but the emotional turmoil that's happening underneath, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Beautifully put, Patty. Thank you. Did you have anything else that you wanted to share? Couple, like 5 more minutes worth of content. I
I
don't want to
think
put you on the spot, but it's
no,
up totally up to you.
I think one of the important things is that emotional piece. At the base of all of this, starting, I mean, we can go through how to start conversations, what to say, all of that kind of stuff. But I think the base of all of this is understanding um, the emotions that come up with this, and our capacity that comes or doesn't come with us. As we are caregiving, our capacity diminishes, our batteries run low. And when our batteries run low, emotions run high. And so it's very easily to kind of get sucked into things. And so I think the awareness that, when we are a little bit snippy or when we are a little bit sadder, that those are all signs. Our bodies are talking to us and they're saying that I'm not doing so great. And so, what can I do in this moment to kind of step back and help, find those supports for me? And that it is okay to step up and say, I need help. I need support, and find it in whatever way possible, right? There is lots of out there. It's just the finding it, right, of the supports around it. Yeah, and the guilt that comes up with it, because I should be okay. We feel, when we're given things, okay, I'm the caregiver and I can do this. No, actually, if you look at, how many caregivers at home caring for somebody with dementia, and it is that one person. Now, if that person, I'm not saying the person should go into care, but if you look at if the person was in care, there's a whole team surrounding that person. And that's not what's happening at home. And so, reaching out for a little bit of time for yourself is an important thing, right? Pausing. I often talk about anchoring through your day for anybody, not just somebody who's working with somebody with a serious illness. Um, Finding those moments through the day doesn't have to be long. It can be just step outside and breathe some air for a few minutes. It can be pausing, hands on your chest, and a few really slow, deep breaths and going on with your day. That only takes 2 minutes because I know people feel pressured. I don't have time for self-care. Self-care is not about bubble baths. Self-care is about doing those things that just help tether you back to this moment in time,
Mhm.
right? And how important that is, just those little moments, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Would it help with more conversations, examples of conversations?
If you have it handy, we can pop it up. We've got a few more minutes here, and
Yeah,
there's
a
still
little
some
bit,
folks on the attending. So yeah, if you can
right?
navigate that.
Um, you know, because there's always different ways in, right? Not everybody is the same. So, it can be something as, hey, can I ask something important? Right? I realized the other day, that's often a good one. Things, that's what I said about movies. There's often those little moments that just give you entryway in. I heard something recently about I heard something recent. I'm on the internet and I saw this thing about advanced care planning, and it made me realize we've never actually talked about what you would want, right? Or I was with somebody the other day and they were talking about this and it made me think, right? I mean, you can meet, I don't know, there my dad's on here. Sorry, mom. But my mom was like that. I tried to have a conversation with her because she had some significant health challenges, but she was like, nope, not going to be. So, there's a great moment of, how do we do that? And so it steps us into, okay, what do I think she would want, right? Um, the humanity of it. You may meet a brick wall and what can you do? There's not much that you can do. Um
Thank you
uh
for saying that, Patty, because that's a big one, right? Because so many people will try this approach, that approach, but it's just a brick wall coming up, and then
yeah. Yeah.
that's just the way it is, right?
And then
And
and then you yeah. And then you have
And
to
then
give
they
yourself
have the guilt, right? And you feel the guilt because you don't
yeah,
know, but you weren't able to find out before.
right?
Mhm.
And is this right or is this wrong? And is this, and so I think, then giving yourself a little bit of grace and compassion, because, we don't set out to say, okay, how can I make this worse for my loved one? We set out to say, how can I make the best for this, right? What is the best decision? And so I think we have to kind of make sure we realize that that is the core of what we're also looking at, right? For sure. I think too, I'm trying to think of some other starters. Um, values, often talking about values instead of other squishy stuff, right? What makes life feel meaning for you right now? If we think of that example of the Tua Gwandi, what felt for one was I want to be able to play tennis and run, where the other gentleman was like, I'm okay if I can watch football. Oh, I like spending time with family. Okay, we know they like spending time with family. How can we best, what that is for them that we can do for them that helps those things that are meaningful for them, right?
Yeah.
Um, I recently had someone, they were talking about the shift in their loved one with a serious illness. What was meaningful for them was gardening. They had a huge, huge garden. But we know, as in anything, as people decline in life, the world gets smaller, right? Social things get smaller, foods even get smaller. And so their garden got smaller to eventually they had created on their patio a little garden because they could at least get out there and putter in the dirt. And then, closer to end of life, when they couldn't even get on the patio, we created ways for them to play in the dirt in the house. That's a meaningful thing for them. And so what can we do to help that, bring that into them? Another question, if your health were to change, what's important for you to hold on to? What does that look like for you? Are there things that you would really want to avoid? And I know a lot of times people say long-term care, I don't want to go long-term care. Okay, we will do the best we can. However, if that is to happen, sometimes it's outside of our control. And so, what would you value the most if you had to go there? What would we want to make sure that we had for you? Your favorite chair, your favorite this, your favorite that, surrounding you with family. Like what would that kind of look like? Um, when somebody's hesitant, we don't have to figure out everything right now. I think because they feel like we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about all of it. And that is some people, I can think of some people would be like, nope, I need this whole thing filled out today. No, 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 little tiny bits and pieces, right? Especially when they're hesitant. I just want to start understanding what matters to you, right? We
Yeah.
can take this slowly, even if it's just a little bit about anything little is helpful, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Baby steps.
Baby steps, huge, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking like with dementia and early changes, everybody, it's so funny. Everybody knows there's an elephant in the room, but nobody ever wants to speak up and say anything. And so I think that, right? I know things have been changing a bit, right? And I want to make sure that I understand what matters most to you while we can still talk about it together. They know the
Mm.
person experiencing, they know that they're changing. They're not oblivious to it. They know, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, when you're worried about upsetting them, I'm not asking because anything is wrong right now. I just care about you. And I want to make sure that I understand if anything was to ever happen, I understand what you would want,
Mhm.
right? Or, in a health situation, doctors are asking questions. And I want to make sure, we're making decisions that reflect what matters to you the most.
Mhm.
Not what's important to the doctors, not what's important to me, but what's important to you,
Yeah.
right?
Those are all such really good segues, and I hope that people have tucked them into their back pocket, Patty. And we are recording this webinar, so it will be available on our YouTube channel very soon. And unless there's any more questions, or I'm going to invite Sonia to reflect or ask another question, and then we'll wrap things up. So,
That was really beautiful, I think. The big takeaways, right, are really thinking about this isn't a rush. We've got time.
We have time.
We
Yeah.
can do this gently.
Even
Yeah.
though inside you're feeling like, I don't have time, I got to do. No, no, no. Because as soon as this happens, boom, everything shuts down, right?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's not about the perfect things. It's about will, that starting,
That's
just,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. And I've been thinking and talking about yourself because
Mhm.
then it's not about, I think there's a fear from the people that have been hesitant to speak about it or even hesitant to complete a power of attorney. Um,
Yeah.
there's that fear of if I do that, then that means something
It's gonna
must be
happen.
coming, right? And
Or it's
so
gonna
it's,
happen. If I do
yeah,
this, it's gonna happen.
that's right.
I'm gonna tell you, it's gonna happen. I don't know anybody that's got out of this life alive. So, yeah, it is gonna happen. And what can we do to help those around us? Navigate those conversations for, like in our case, how many caregivers do I work with, professionals that don't have their stuff in order? We should know better, but we don't because we, just as much as everybody else, really hesitate. And yet we see the impact when that stuff hasn't been done, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. Hard part of
Oh,
life.
there's a little question. What is your YouTube channel? It's not on your email. Correct. So anyone who has attended will receive the link to the webinar recording once it's uploaded. But you can also find it on our website under resources. And then you go to the left-hand side of the page and scroll down to webinars. And the most recently recorded webinars will be right there on that archived, on the page of archived videos. I hope that's helpful and I hope it's clear. Probably by 8:22 at night, I may not be as clear as I normally am.
Good. That's good that you've had that too, because that financial world I don't know as well, and I know there's been a lot of changes. So that's yay to
And
McCormick for
it's
doing that.
very, very context dependent. Every
Yes.
time I watch a webinar, and I don't just watch ours, I seek them from
Yeah,
other sites as well. And it's like, oh, yeah, it is very, very context.
it really is. It's not as cut and dried. Yeah. Yeah.
I have one more question, Patty, if you just will take us out this way, but just to explain a little bit to folks about what exactly does a death doula do? So if someone were to phone you up and say, "Could you be
Hey,
my
right.
death doula?" What
Yeah.
exactly would you do to sort of walk someone through that process?
I often talk about death doulas. So death doulas, that's a grassroots thing, kind of like where midwives began, right? And so here's that word dependent again. It's really dependent. I often look at it in three pillars: that advanced care planning piece, that dying and death piece, and that grief and bereavement piece. And just, it each death doula does things differently. I have some colleagues who only do the advanced care planning things. They sit with families, figure out what that looks like for them, works through that paperwork, all of those things, making sure things are in order. Um, then in that dying and death piece, the walking with them, I support. So if I look at my own practice, I I don't necessarily do all the, I will, but I don't necessarily do all the formal paperwork, but exploring the wishes, kind of, walking through those, whatever those wishes might be, somebody who wants to go to hospice, somebody who is considering MAID, somebody who's considering, dying at home. What does that kind of look like? And then, supporting the family and the individual through that process. Doulas will sit with them. I have some colleagues who are death doulas and PSWs, so then they're able to do that piece of things with them. I have a colleague who's a dietitian, so she loves, supporting the family with food and nutrition and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of variations through doulas, and so working with families, through that dying process, helping people understand and educate them. How many times people aren't aware of what dying actually looks like, and that's an important piece to it because when you can understand that that breathing change is actually a normal part of the dying process, anxiety comes down. Does it change our sadness and grief? Not at all, but helps that anxiety of, oh my gosh, what's happening now, right? And all of those markers and things of the body going through the dying process. And then that grief and bereavement process afterwards, supporting families as they grieve the loss of their loved one. What else is involved? Like that legacy piece, like I talked about the video that I sat with a client, and it was really kind of a cool experience. Went from childhood all the way through life, talking about kind of like a little bit of a memoir, but just, and it was easier, the two of us together, for them just to sit and record it themselves is hard. But when there was two of us to banter back and forth a little bit, it made that a little bit easier and left kind of that legacy piece for their family, for sure. Education, huge part of also death doula, right? Doing things like this. I also co-facilitate a doula program. I do a lot of speaking. I've co-authored a book on death and dying. And so, advocacy is another part of doulas, advocating for people who sometimes aren't able to advocate for themselves. And I also I do a workshop on advanced care planning. It's a really cool one. It's not actually sitting and doing paperwork and stuff. It's actually art-based. So we sit and, work through what your values are. And then we, break into 4 sections on a paper and create, who would you want with you? Where would you want to be? What kind of do you want to be remembered? And kind of that legacy piece. And it's all art-based. So it's really cool to see how people will explore those worlds when you're not face to face figuring stuff out that way. There's those tough conversations to navigate for sure. Yeah. Does that help give you some answers?
Absolutely. That was great. And I think a lot more fulsome than people understand, right? As far as what is exactly involved in that and what are all the processes. So you answered that beautifully. I appreciate it. And
No
sounds
problem.
like there's lots of exciting things happening for you as well. So yeah.
That's good.
Okay. Well, I think we can wrap this up in a bow for now. Dot, dot, dot. I just want to thank everyone for coming, for taking the time, and for, being open to these conversations, which are so very important.
Mhm.
And Patty, thank you so much for giving from your heart. That means so much to us.
Thank you for helping everyone start the conversation. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay. Sonia, do you want to stop the recording?